All right, and we are recording this session today so that it'll be viewable later on. So welcome everybody to our latest edition of Thursdays at 4, put on by Wisconsin Lakes and Rivers Partnership. I'm Mike Engleson. I'm the Executive Director of Wisconsin Lakes, the nonprofit conservation association of lake associations, lake districts, and lake stakeholders in Wisconsin. We're going to be talking about annual meetings for lake districts during COVID in 2021 today. And just as a reminder, Eric already mentioned this, but you can ask questions in the chat, which you can get to probably down at the bottom of your screen. There should be a button that says chat, and that'll open up a little window. You can type your questions in there. Eric will answer some of them on the fly in the chat box, and some of them we can talk through. Going to cover a number of different topics today. First, just a really quick discussion of the difference between lake districts and lake association meetings. This session is really designed around lake district meetings, but I know some of you might be on here from lake associations or maybe from lake associations and thinking about forming a lake district and might be interested in hearing about what happens. Then we're going to be joined by Krista Westerberg, an attorney who has expertise in open meetings law. So she'll be filling us in about that and what that means as far as virtual meetings and how things are being handled here in the pandemic as well. We'll cover the basics of both Lake District Commissioner and annual meetings, and then talk a little bit about lessons learned from 2020, how meetings were handled, what worked, what didn't in 2020 during the height of the pandemic, and I'm looking forward to 2021, and hopefully there'll be plenty of time for lots of discussion at that point. But first, very quickly, I wanted to go over the difference between district and association meetings. So lake districts, because they are a governmental unit created under state law, there are specific statutory provisions that lake districts are going to need to follow. For lake associations, their meetings don't have as many statutory guidelines. There are some, but not as many. And lake associations really look more to their bylaws as to how they're structured for what they can and can't do at meetings. Lake districts tend not to have bylaws, and the statutes will always preempt those bylaws if they conflict anyway. The biggest difference is that lake districts have to follow open meetings and open records laws, whereas lake associations generally don't. They might in certain circumstances, if for instance, they're getting, if there's a nonprofit that's getting federal funds or is in some sort of coalition arrangement with other groups where those laws are triggered, but on their own in general, lake associations don't have to follow open meetings law, unless Krista tells you differently. And then finally, lake districts, the content and the process for your annual meetings are really set by the statute. There's much more flexibility in annual meetings for lake associations. There are statutory provisions, and there is a requirement for annual meetings if you are a membership organization as a lake association. But because you're a nonprofit organization rather than a governmental body, again, it's a completely different set of stuff. So most of what we're going to be talking about from here on out is going to relate to meetings for lake districts. And with that, I'm going to turn things over for this first section to Krista to talk about open meetings law, because a lot of the issues that we come up with and a lot of the questions that we came up with last year with COVID related things was how open meetings can work, how virtual meetings can work and stuff. So I thought it would be a good idea to bring someone in that knew more about it than I did. And that would be Krista, who works for Pines Bach. Krista also has worked with a number of lake districts and lake associations on different matters, and actually wrote a great brief that we filed on a shoreline zoning case just recently, which we got good results on. So, but I won't get into that right now. So I'm going to unshare my screen, and you are a co-host, Krista, so you should be able to take over.
Sounds good. Okay, let me get mine pulled up. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right. And do you see is the big screen that says open meetings during COVID and beyond?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. My name is Krista Westerberg. As Mike said, I'm an attorney at Pines Bach in Madison. A lot of my work is environmental and, about water quality, but a fair bit of it has to do with open records and open meetings law as well. And so, of course, it's been a real interesting year or so when you're trying to figure out how to comply with the open meetings and records law as a governmental body. But there's some lessons that have been learned, and people are now kind of moving to the question of whether you can carry over some of the things that we've developed during the pandemic into normal life, if and when we ever get to that. So let me start by saying that a lot of the guidance and that's kind of COVID specific about open meetings and virtual meetings in particular comes from the Wisconsin Department of Justice Office of Open Government. There really have not been a lot of court cases or any court cases, I don't think, dealing with the open meetings law specifically as it applies to virtual meetings or some of the procedures that people have been following during COVID. So, the next place we look, short of a court case for authority is the Wisconsin Department of Justice, because the Attorney General under our open meetings and open records law has some specific authority to interpret the law. And in fact, one of the nice things about our law in Wisconsin is that anybody can write the Attorney General's office for advice about the open meetings or records law, and they can get a response. You don't have to be a governmental body. You don't have to be a government employee or official. Anybody in the state can request guidance from the Attorney General's office. But in the case of COVID, they've done a fair amount of sort of pushing out some guidance. And so that's mostly what I'm going to go over. And maybe some of you are familiar with this. And you've already consulted the Attorney General's office, and maybe this is old news. But just to kind of start off, there are really three basic requirements for a meeting under the open meetings law. One is that the meeting has to be reasonably accessible to members of the public. Two, the meeting has to be preceded by public notice. And then the third is that the meeting should be held in open session unless a specific exemption allowing a closed session applies. So I'm going to kind of go through each of these three things relative to COVID and virtual meetings. So, one of the big questions that came up last year as COVID was hitting is, are virtual meetings reasonably accessible? Are they reasonably accessible to members of the public? And the Wisconsin Department of Justice issued two items of guidance last year, and then they followed it up with another one this year, and that's where I'm getting most of this. But, for years, the Department of Justice has said that telephone conference calls are an allowable way to have a meeting. And as long as the public can join that call and gets the information to do so, that is reasonably accessible and perfectly okay. The next question is, are Zoom and similar platforms reasonably accessible? And last year, what the Attorney General's office said is, yes, they are under the circumstances that we are in right now with COVID. People need to feel safe, and remote meetings were really one of the best options for that. But more recently, just this past March, during Sunshine Week, which is about mid-March every year, their most recent guidance said that maybe it might be appropriate to continue having virtual meetings if doing so will increase accessibility. And for a lot of us, it really might, because we may be more inclined to go to a virtual meeting rather than get in our cars and drive somewhere and sit in a meeting that way. So it's so that was an interesting development to see in their guidance. The Department of Justice advises providing a phone option. So if people are, don't have access to the internet, or, they can't use remote meeting technology like Zoom, give them a phone number they can call into so that they don't have to try to find internet access in order to attend the meeting or get some help doing that. One of the items of guidance last year is that remote access may not be reasonably, oops, there's a typo there, sorry, reasonably accessible if the governmental body is discussing like some sort of complicated plan, or when you need to be able to see witnesses testifying, things where it's really sort of necessary to be in the room. If there's a document everybody in the remote meeting is referring to, but people at home can't see it, they can't really understand what's going on or participate quite as well. The department also suggests that speakers should identify themselves. So people who are members of the governmental body, before, at the beginning of the meeting, and then before they speak should say who they are. So people who are just listening in can know who's talking. And then the department also suggested that accommodation may be needed for people who are hard of hearing and can't use the remote technology as well as people without those difficulties. So the short answer is virtual reasonably accessible? Yes. Is it likely to be so after COVID? Yeah, if you can make an argument that it increases accessibility. Because this is still, though, only Department of Justice guidance, a court could always disagree with the Department of Justice. So just bear that in mind. But, for now, this is really the best sort of authority we have to go on.
Hey, Krista, we're getting just a little bit of interference. I think your mic may be rubbing up against your clothes.
Okay, how's that?
That's better, yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Another really interesting issue that has come up is not holding meetings virtually reasonably accessible. And there was a Wisconsin State Journal story about this at some point during the last year, where a governmental body was refusing to hold meetings virtually, and then they, members of the body weren't wearing masks, and they weren't requiring attendees to wear masks. And I think they traced some cases of COVID to those meetings. So the Department of Justice hasn't gone so far as to say you have to require meeting members and attendees to wear masks. But they just said, keep what the evolving health situation in mind as you are making decisions about how to conduct your open meetings. But there are some out there who think that, a failure to require masks, if you're also going to require in-person attendance, could mean a meeting is not reasonably accessible because people might not want to risk their health by showing up to the meeting in person. So, it's been just a really interesting question, but I think generally remote access is seen as a good alternative. So, if you're not going to require masks, at least people would have the option to attend remotely. So that second big requirement for open meetings is, they've got to be publicly noticed. The statute is pretty specific about what it has to be in a notice, the time, date, and place, and subject matter of the meeting. For virtual meetings, the Department of Justice advises including the teleconference dial and information if you're going to meet virtually, the video link, any necessary login information and passcode. I think those are all things we're pretty used to doing right now. But it makes sense that, that information would need to be in the notice so people can attend if they want. The department also suggests recording the meeting and then making it available on a website or social media afterwards as soon as you can. But, that's not a requirement of the law. I think it is probably best practice. And then the recording itself is probably an open record too. The last big requirement, open session, same as it ever was, excuse my talking heads reference, but it's, the rules really haven't changed as to open session. So, number one, hold the too is kind of an interesting point. It might be a little bit more tempting for people who are members of a governmental body to communicate by text during a meeting with one another. And that really shouldn't be happening. All of those communications should really be made during the meeting so people can hear them, and not, having sort of a sub conversation during the meeting. You could maybe make the same argument for comments in Zoom, especially if you make those comments just to certain members of the body and not to everybody to see. But even if it was for everyone to see, that's probably not a good practice, because then people who are attending by phone couldn't see them. So there was this came up a few years ago, even before COVID, in the city of Madison. The Common Council was caught. Several of the members were caught texting with one another during a meeting about what was going on in the meeting. And there was a big uproar about that. And so again, it might just be a little bit more tempting to do that since you're not all able to be in the same room. But that's probably something that should be avoided. And then the last item is to make a record of motion and roll call votes, just like you normally would. So that's really all I have. The Wisconsin Department of Justice Office of Open Government, you can find them online, and that's where the 3 items of guidance that I've been talking about are all posted, and as well as a lot of other great guidance about the public records and open meetings law. So that's all I have.
Great. Thank you so much, Krista. That was a great overview. I know we have some questions in the chat, and I have a question that came up sometimes last year in terms of holding virtual meetings. Is there a requirement that at least one person from the meeting be in? First off, with the Lake District, you may have, the commissioners. It's quite possible that none of the commissioners may be located in the district full time. So can a virtual meeting be led virtually from completely outside the geographic scope of the district? Or does there have to be some sort of physical connection to the government, to the area being governed, I guess?
I haven't seen anything on that issue. So that requires, there to be some sort of physical presence of the meeting in the jurisdiction where the meeting is quote unquote happening. So that's not something that I've seen.
Okay, great. Ron asks, can the public notice just indicate the person to contact to obtain the joining information, or must the notice include the joining information? It would be hard to post a link in a notice, but easier to post in an email.
The guidance, I think it says to post the joining information, rather than just a person to contact to get the joining information. Maybe somebody doesn't want to let the world know they're planning to join. I don't know. But I would say there's nothing, I haven't seen anything specific on that, except for that the department recommends posting the joining information.
Okay. Would it be safe to say the best thing is probably to err on the side of giving more information than is necessary than less?
Yeah, if you want to gild the lily, that's never a bad idea. And maybe you do both and say, you post contact information so that if people are having difficulties, they have a place to go and a number right there at their fingertips.
Great. Karen asks, can the board members meet outside of the meeting regarding the upcoming meeting agenda?
That's probably not a great idea because of the issue of walking quorum. So if you have a quorum of people who are meeting to discuss what should be on the agenda, somebody could say, well, that itself is a meeting. You're agreeing on some action. So I realize that's difficult because you're just deciding what you're going to talk about. But one way to do it is sort of to designate a person who is in charge of the agenda, and then have people just send information in to that person, so you're not having an exchange of information between a number of people. Having said that, there's been a couple of recent cases discussing walking quorums, and one thing they really focus on is the people who are part of the governmental body, that they reach agreement as to some course of action. And I don't think a court has said that agreeing on an agenda would satisfy that, but I'd err on the side of caution.
This is a related question, I guess. Are there any issues with emails being sent to the commissioners regarding topics and discussions regarding our Lake District between our quarterly meetings, such as agenda items, et cetera? So I think what James is talking about there is members of the district sending items for consideration or discussing an issue with individual commissioners.
Right. So the Department of Justice has said that a meeting can happen through electronic communications, including emails that are sent around to one another. So you would just want to try to avoid having a quorum beyond those communications. The courts are starting to distinguish a little bit more now about, like, if information is just being pushed out to commissioners or governmental body members, that's one thing. But if there's sort of an exchange of information or decision making made about it, a challenger might have more luck claiming that was a meeting that happened in violation of the open meetings law.
So if you're a commissioner and you get an email that has all the other commissioners copied on it, maybe don't discuss the topic with the other commissioners, but it might be okay to have a back and forth with the constituent, right?
Yeah. And I would avoid reply all.
Sure. Karen asks, are the emails between commissioners supposed to be public? And if so, where can the public go to see the emails?
What would probably happen there is somebody would have to make a request under the open records law for the emails. So, they don't need to be posted unless an email chain is, a meeting. And then you've got to figure out how to make that email chain reasonably accessible to everybody else, before it happened. So it's a little bit complicated, but I would, usually emails like that are requested after the fact.
Right. It doesn't
I'll follow up on that.
Yeah.
Lake districts are these relatively small units of local government. They're some of the smallest, right? And they're almost completely run by volunteers. If someone did want to make a open records request about emails of a commissioner, where would they even start?
I haven't looked at so the open records requests typically need to be made to the custodian of the record. And, so that I haven't looked to see who the custodian is in the case of a Lake district. But maybe it would be, the board secretary, or, I'm assuming, if there's no staff, then obviously you wouldn't go there, but it would probably be to one of the board members, the chair or the secretary, I'm guessing, but I'm not sure.
And then if they resist or refuse?
Then somebody could file a lawsuit saying they were unlawfully denied records.
Sure. Does that happen fairly commonly in Wisconsin, or kind of what's our history been?
I haven't heard about it with an open records lawsuit being filed against a Lake district. Not saying that it's never happened, but I can't think of one. But people do file lawsuits under the open records law all the time. And if they win, they get their attorney's fees. So, there's not, the law is written in that way to encourage lawsuits.
And to favor public access, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not just litigation for its own sake. It's for public information and understanding the function of government.
And I'm thinking an email request in the case of a Lake district, like Eric said, oftentimes volunteers, the district itself may not even have its own email system. So I wouldn't be surprised if business isn't being conducted via personal emails, which has got to make it even more complicated, but still required to give those over, right?
Yeah, just because something's not on a government server or something like that doesn't mean it's not accessible. What matters is the content and whether it's discussing governmental business.
And then I have one last question. You talked about the whether or not requiring masks is something that would result one way or another in reasonable access. The question that I wonder if it will come up some this summer will be, what about requiring vaccinations? Has there been any talk on whether that is something that whether or not you could require a vaccination as a governmental body to be allowed to attend a meeting?
I have not heard anybody say that. I would be, it's kind of the reverse of the masks. Then you're excluding somebody rather than deterring them from coming, so, but yeah, that's not come up in the chatter that I've heard. But, again, anybody can write the Department of Justice and ask for information about the open meetings law. So somebody could certainly do that. But, my first instinct is that might deter access and would, not probably be looked well upon, especially if there are other options to ensure safety.
Great. Yeah, that's kind of what I assumed that you were going to answer. Ron posted what the link would look like if they had to post the link in the notice, which, yes, that's a big, long, complicated thing that probably no one's going to copy over.
Mm-hmm.
I think my point was just that if you can't get challenged if it's in there,
Mm-hmm.
and somebody could. So
yeah, and there's a service called tinyurl. If you've never used it before, it's the website is literally called tinyurl, and it converts a long URL into a small one. So that might be an option.
Just to clarify, I'm a first-time commissioner. Commissioners cannot meet as a team to discuss constituent concerns or lake business. Is this correct?
Yeah, it's got to be in a, it's fine to do all of that, but it should be in an open meeting.
Right. And then we have time, I think, for one more question here. So do you recommend that lake commissioners have a separate email address for just district meetings, so all their personal emails are subject, so their personal emails are not subject to open records?
I mean, I would do that if, just to stay organized myself, but, it would be highly unlikely that in an open records lawsuit, somebody would go and get a subpoena and require Google to search your emails and, or, your Gmail account and turn over records that way. Usually the courts rely on people to just search their own stuff and produce it that way. But yeah, I think that's what we would call a best practice, is to keep a designated email address for that purpose.
It's so easy now for organizations to get an email system set up, even just using Gmail or something like that. And it allows for continuity to those emails, that you don't have to worry about a decision that a commissioner made 15 years ago in an email, though you have access to those emails without going back to that person whose personal account, may not exist anymore if they've moved on or something like that. So with that, I think we'll conclude that section. So thank you so much, Krista. You are welcome to stay on for as much of this as you would like. Like I said, we're hoping to have open discussion time at the end, but I think you might have to take off for another endeavor. So thank you so much for joining us.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me. And it's nice to be here. And thank you to all of the commissioners out there for your service.
All right. And with that, if you'll stop sharing,
yep.
I will.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Krista. All right. Hopefully you're back onto my screen now.
Correct.
Great. So next, I want to go through for people that are new to Lake District meetings, or as a refresher for those of you who are experienced, just go through the different forms of meetings and the basics and what the statutory requirements of them are. So of course, there are basically 2 or 3 different kinds of district meetings. There are meetings of the Board of Commissioners, And then there's the annual meeting of the members, and occasionally there's a special meeting of the members as well. The Board of Commissioner meetings are fairly simple as far as the statutes are concerned. The board must meet quarterly, so that's statutory. And for all of these, I put the statutory reference on the slide for the most part, I believe. So anything you see that in parentheses that starts with 33, that refers to Chapter 33 of the Wisconsin statutes. So the Board of Commissioners, they have to meet quarterly, and they can meet at other times on the call of either the chair of the board or by petition of at least 3 commissioners. As we've just discussed, those meetings are subject to open meetings and open records law. And basically that's just to conduct the business of the district and execute the powers of the board as designated in the statute. There's not really a whole lot else that the statute covers. As to the exact form of how those meetings happen. I think many groups use Robert's Rules of Order or some form for their the way the meetings are run. But as far as the statutes are concerned, as far as Chapter 33 is concerned, that's really all it says. Annual meetings are another beast. Obviously, these are the meetings that you have every year, where the members of the district come together and can vote. So they're held by statute, they must be held between May 22nd and September 8th, unless scheduled outside those dates by a majority vote of the previous annual meeting. Now, I don't know if we've ever talked about this, but it occurred to me as I was reading that earlier today, that statute earlier today, there's an implication that may have to, if say that you normally have your meeting on October 1st for some reason, or the first Saturday in October, say, that may have to be reapproved annually. Eric, do you know, is that something that is typically done by groups, or have we told people in the past that they can, if they do it once, then it becomes standard?
The annual meeting that I've attended that's outside of those dates, they do close the meeting by voting on when they're going to meet next.
That does seem to be what the statute indicates to me, at least. And I should give the disclaimer that neither Eric nor I are acting as an attorney, so you shouldn't take our advice as legal advice. We're giving our best opinions of sort of what the best practices are, what the statute says, and way districts have interpreted it in the past. So notice must be, according to statute, mailed 14 days in advance of the annual meeting, and it has to be mailed to electors, property owners, and we'll get into what property owners means later. And then notice also has to be given to the Department of Natural Resources. The statutes do allow for a Class 2 notice to be provided. Class 2 notice means published in the newspaper, essentially in place of mailing to the electors. Again, I think the statute's a little bit ambiguous as to whether or not that suffices for property owners, but I think probably you should still mail to property owners. Eric, you got a thought on that?
Our general advice is to always mail to property owners. If you pull up that section of statute, there's commas that separate each one of these things and makes it clear that they're distinct, that property owners are a class of themselves, and that you cannot substitute property owners the way you can substitute these electors. Electors basically refers to people who happen to live within the district, so it's their normal voting location, but they may not be property owners, so they could be renters.
Exactly. And it makes sense because property owners may not live within the district necessarily. And so they may not see a notice if it's, especially if it's published as a Class 2. No absentee or proxy ballots are allowed according to statute. So you can't have someone else come to a meeting and vote for you. There will be a caveat to that we may get into in a bit. It's not really a caveat, but it's a sometimes misunderstood provision in who gets to vote. What that notice that gets sent out must include is the proposed annual budget that the Board of Commissioners has put together. Items for consideration that were added to the agenda by the Board of Commissioners, and items for consideration by anybody that was eligible to vote at the annual meeting, as long as it relates to issues within the district's authority. So you can have an item for consideration put up as to whether or not the Packers are America's team. It's a stupid question, I know, but they have to be submitted by petition to the board at least 30 days before the meeting, and they have to be signed by eligible voters totaling at least 20% of the number of taxable parcels in the district. So we've sent out the notice. People have come to whatever location has been selected and the annual meeting has begun. What has to happen at that meeting is that you must elect by secret ballot commissioner slots that are up for election. Secret ballot is in bold because that's one of the key pieces that led us to conclude last year that Lake District annual meetings simply cannot be held virtually. And I'll get to that into that in more detail momentarily. In addition to electing commissioners, you also have to approve the budget for the year. That's a slightly separate process from the election and has less requirements as to how that occurs. I'll get into that a little bit more in the next slide too. But before we get there, at the annual meeting, you can also, you don't have to, but you may levy property tax, conduct other business, sort of a general catch-all category, establish compensation for directors, or create an ongoing fund for specific capital costs and capital maintenance. So basically set up a capital fund that allows you to, doesn't go away at the end of the fiscal year. It doesn't lapse with the end of one budget. So one of the key pieces that has to happen at an annual meeting is the election. And there are some very specific requirements now. Some of them are relatively new, only in the last year or two have they been added to the statute that need to be followed. So when electing and remember, this applies only to the election of the commissioner, not necessarily to the way the budget is approved. Elections have to be conducted by ballot, and those ballots must be distributed to qualified voters at the meeting. The easiest way to think of this, I think, is that remember that lake districts are a governmental body, like a school district, like a town, like any other governmental body in the state. And so you're following the same sort of balloting process that would happen for any other entity. Very specifically, however, this statute says that ballots are only distributed at the meeting, and they can't be distributed after voting commences, and the election has to be by secret ballot. So the ballot can't really identify who it is that's doing the voting. They have to get the ballot at the meeting, but then if someone shows up late and voting has already started, it's too late. They can't get another ballot. Ballots are counted and the results have to be announced at the meeting. And this is important because of the recount process that the statutes now hold. I'm not going to go, for an interest in time, if someone wants to ask a question about that, they can. I'm not going to go into the details of how the recount process works, but it occurs almost immediately at the meeting. And that recount can be requested by either an elector or a candidate. Interestingly enough, it doesn't say anything about property owners requesting a recount. I believe that probably was a drafting error. I don't think property owners, I think it was meant to be not electors, but people who are eligible to vote at the meeting can request a recount. But that's not what the statute currently says. So currently only an elector or the candidate can request that recount. So because it has to be a secret ballot, because it has to be a ballot that can be counted, and because the recount process has things like the ballots have to be, if it ends up having to go to a town clerk, yes, it can get that complicated. The ballots have to be collected and sealed in a tamper-proof container. There's no way to get around that not being something physical, which you can't do electronically. So we really did not believe that there was any way that that commissioner elections could happen by anything other than an in-person meeting. Eric, I'll pause if there are any one or two quick questions.
Yeah, there was just a question about how do you collect the secret ballots, which you kind of addressed there. I think I've seen meetings where, you know, if everyone's sitting in a big auditorium as they were back in the day, there would be kind of gophers running around and just grabbing pieces of paper and packing them together. But you could also use a container or a box that people would get up and drop them into. Another question about what if only one person is running for a seat? Our guidance in People of Lakes does say that even in an uncontested election, you really ought to stick to the habit of adhering to a secret ballot.
Yeah, again, it's very much like a regular election. Even if someone is running unopposed, those it's not like the results aren't counted and announced. They still are. The secretary does the counting of the ballots, and there are some rules that if the candidates want to watch that counting, that they have to be provided that opportunity. That's another reason why it just doesn't work with anything other than physical ballots. So then the question sort of becomes, who gets to vote? And we know, so Eric already explained what electors are. Electors is anybody in the district, living in the district, that would normally get to vote in other elections. So if there is a building with tenants on the lake, then all of those tenants, if they're eligible to vote in a normal election, would be eligible to vote in the Lake District meeting. That can sometimes surprise people. A husband and wife, both and their adult child, say, you know, the child has turned 18, all three of them, if they are living at the lake and would qualify to vote in other elections, would be able to vote in the at the annual meeting as an elector. Then the second category of eligible voters, which is different than in any other form of election in the state of Wisconsin, as far as I know, is that property owners are allowed to vote. Now, Chapter 33 defines property owners differently for different actions. So I'm going to go over here what it means to be a property owner in terms of voting in a Lake District annual meeting. You have to be a US citizen who is 18 or older, so eligible to vote elsewhere. And then one of the following has to be the case. Your name has to appear on the tax roll. If your name doesn't appear on the tax roll, but you own title to real property in the district, so the tax roll may, if a property is owned by a bunch of different people jointly, it might be that only one person's name appears on the tax roll, and then it says something like et al. Or something like that. If the title says John Smith, Bob Smith, joint tenancy or whatever, then both of them would qualify as property owners. If the title or the tax roll said the Bob and John Smith Brotherly Trust, then only one person who would be the designated official representative of that entity would get to vote. So if a property is owned in the district by a trust, a foundation, a corporation, an association, or an organization that owns real property, any organization that owns real property in the district, all of those sorts of entities get to designate a person, and that person can vote for them. So in that case, it sounds a little bit like there's someone voting as a proxy. You can't get around that because obviously the corporate entity has to send someone as a human. And and so that person ends up being the person that's able to vote. There are, I'm sure, lots of other questions that will come up as far as voting, and I think I'm going to leave the discussion of that until the end, and we can follow that down whatever rabbit holes we end up wanting to follow down. And maybe Eric's been answering some of it in the chat too. So those are always questions that come up. In addition to annual meetings, there can be special meetings. Those are covered under section .305 of chapter 33. Special meetings are scheduled at the call of the Board of Commissioners. They're again a full membership meeting of the district like the annual meeting. They can be scheduled at the call of the Board of Commissioners, or the board must call one if there's a petition signed by at least 10% of electors and property owners in the district. Here, property owners defined a little differently. It's a person who appears on the tax roll and their spouse. So that's cuts out some of those other qualifications for voting as a property owner. Don't include being counted as to whether in the count for a petition to get a special meeting called. Notice is required. Actions at special meetings basically can be anything that can be done in an annual meeting, except you can't approve a new budget. You can consider and vote on amendments to the existing budget, but if you can't approve the new annual budget for the year, you can't consider dissolving or dissolution of the district. And if there was a special meeting that already decided something, you can't revisit that in a new special meeting. Again, no absentee ballots or proxies. So those are the basics of the three different types of late district special meetings. And we went through all of this last year as well, and it was much more complicated, obviously, because we were in a in the beginning of the pandemic, really didn't know what we were doing and had lots and lots of questions, and there were many more health orders, and it was much more difficult for people to come together and meet and know whether it was going to be safe. I think this summer is going to be a little bit different. I'll talk a little bit about what we learned from last year, but I'm interested to hear what you all have to say as well. If you were in a district and had meetings, how you handled it. The things to remember, I think, remember that the law is the law, that we still have open meetings laws that we have to follow, and we still have requirements of chapter 33 that prevent, for instance, an annual meeting from being held virtually. We still need to follow that, but we want to also make sure that we're maximizing the ability of people who want to participate in these sorts of meetings to be able to participate. That's the drive behind open meetings, and really that should be the drive behind everything we do, because as a governmental body, we're part of our democracy, and we want to have as much participation from people who are interested in participating, especially in something that sort of follows that sort of town meeting concept that that a Lake District annual meeting does. So finding ways to make sure as many people are able to participate, but participate safely while following the law is important. One thing that you can definitely do is work with your local health authorities to find out what kind of restrictions might be in place in your county. There's obviously nothing, there aren't any mandates at the state level because the Supreme Court struck down whatever had been in place, and I'm not sure any of them would have continued to be in place at this point in time anyway. But it's always good to, especially as things are beginning to loosen up more and more, keep in contact with your local health authorities to know exactly what you're able to do and find out even what their recommendations were. And then just some things that happened last year that we thought were helpful. Meet virtually when possible. Doesn't work for an annual meeting, might for the Board of Commissioners. And I think Krista made a really good point that that adding a virtual component to a meeting might actually increase accessibility. I know I've had that discussion with commissioners from districts that, if the winter commissioners meeting may not, that some of the commissioners may be in Florida or Arizona. And so maybe this makes it easier to find the time when that meeting can occur. I've talked to people that have said, normally I would travel back to Wisconsin for that meeting, but if we can get by with doing it that way, that would be great. Meet outside obviously is a great solution. Make sure that you promote safe practices, masks and social distancing. Again, considering that might actually add to access and participation if people are made to feel safe and comfortable. And we saw a couple of districts that actually shortened their meetings so that people weren't together for as long a period of time by providing things like reports and presentations that don't really involve something that's going to be acted on early. So they might be recorded or they might be written down and then entered into the record as by consensus or something like that. But you don't take the time to listen to the full committee report and you get on with the things that you have to do, the voting on the budget and the commissioners and whatever else. So that's all I have. That was sort of the quick tops of the trees overview, I think. And we can delve down into questions. So I'm, I think we're willing to answer questions about how to run meetings in general, but also I'm interested in having a discussion about how things went for you last year, if you had meetings during the pandemic, and what the plans are, what you're thinking about for the future for 2022. So I'll open it up to the floor.
Yeah, and I'm asking people to use the raise hand feature, which is found on your screen where you saw the chat and where you see participants. You should see a reactions button. If you click on that, it just says raise hand. And that just allows me to unmute you and minimize the chances that people are talking over one another. So anybody who wants to chime in, they can raise their hand. I want to make one point, Mike. A year ago, not only were things very uncertain and new to everybody, but I believe we were still at that point a year ago under a stay-at-home order, under an emergency order of the governor, given the nature of the pandemic and where we're at. So the question was, well, okay, let's assume that holds. And if your meeting is going to be at the end of May, you can't meet virtually, but you're going to meet in May, like, are you going to violate, which law are you going to violate? And it was frustrating. And for, I don't know how to put it, but the striking down of the order then in the spring kind of made things quote unquote easier, but it still created a lot of challenges for groups to navigate sort of how to pull a meeting off. So I just want to give credit to anybody on this call who went through that process last year. You survived something that nobody really anticipated when Chapter 33 was written, and when those folks thought, yes, it's a great idea to bring people together physically, to have these meetings, to make sure that they're, looking each other in the eye, and then they're voting to tax themselves to take care of the lake. They didn't envision a circumstance like what we've been through in the last year. One question here says, can the county rep run the annual meeting? So the county, remember from the last meeting, or if you looked at the statutes, the county gets to appoint a member. So that's what is being referred to as a county rep. That county appointee at an annual meeting really can't vote at the annual meeting unless if they happen to own property or reside within that lake district. So at the annual meeting, they're just kind of there as a fellow commissioner. And maybe the suggestion by Dave is that maybe they could chair that meeting. Typically, we actually envision the chair of the board of the commissioners of the lake district to run the annual meeting. However, if there's sort of a tradition that says, we're going to defer to the county rep, and if the county rep agrees to it, then I see nothing wrong with that. The statute doesn't dictate who has to chair the annual meeting. A lot of lake districts contact us and let us know that the county person rarely shows up. So if that was the case, you would not want to count on them to help out with the annual meeting.
Very true. Yes,
another thing I want to mention, kind of following through what you were talking about, Mike, is that when it comes to the lack of proxies, or the reason why you can't do absentee balloting at Lake District annual meetings, is that one of the most important things you're going to do is approve a budget. And usually that means taxing yourself, right? That budget that comes to the annual meeting, the one that gets mailed out in the notice, is really just the draft budget. It's the budget that's proposed by the commissioners. it's at the annual meeting that people can vote on amending that budget. And there's no limit on how many amendments you can make, really. Although there's probably limits on how long people want to stick together and try to hold that meeting. What results then is that the budget that they vote on at the end of all the amendments may not look anything like the budget that was sent out to people. So if you sent out some sort of ballot and said, well, vote on this budget, that's not the budget that everyone else is voting on. So again, these annual meetings really envision active democracy and people participating in person and changing things up as they go. I'm not seeing any hands popping up in my list here. I do know there are follow-up questions from last week about mailing out that annual notice. There's some communities in Wisconsin that are like small villages that have lake districts that were formed to sort of encompass the entire village because there was a mill pond in the district. And so it's not just riparian property owners. The village board at some point said, you know what, just put the whole village in there. We'll call it a lake district. There is a process of forming a lake district that's really, I think, fast and straightforward in such cases. And if everybody in the village is a property owner and they all then are part of the and they're all part of the lake district, you do have to mail that same notice to all of them. And my advice to folks was to, if you're looking at this from a village clerk perspective or the village budget, think about making that mailing more than just the lake district. You could put the lake district notice and the proposed lake district budget into a bigger document, like a village update, something that's communicating important things to everybody in the village, including the lake district information, rather than seeing it as something you have to do just to address that. So Larry Beaumont has a question. I think he can.
Just a quick question.
Sure.
So what I saw at the last couple of our annual meetings is that the electors and property owners can only approve items that are specifically called out on the annual meeting notice. So if a topic comes up during the other business section, that can only be discussion, we were told, and no one can vote on like a policy or procedure change. Is that true?
I mean, that sounds accurate to me. The problem, we've had this question come up before, and the thing you run into is that the open meetings law and the open government statutes broadly don't allow any public meeting to delve into things that weren't on the agenda. So it doesn't matter if it's your school board or your county board or your lake district board, even if it's your annual meeting. If you're making sort of a definitive vote or a decision on something that wasn't on the agenda, then you've violated open meetings law by not having it posted on the agenda. So that's kind of why, if Mike, I don't know if you can go back on the slides about that agenda for the annual meeting. The easiest way to get things on the agenda is for the commissioners themselves to put it on the agenda before they mail out the agenda. Some people say, well, what if there's something that the public wants, added to that agenda, but the board refuses to budge. They don't want to put it on the agenda. This is where there's this process where you can actually, you can request something be added to the agenda. So there it is, the third bullet there. Mm-hmm. So you do have to get a certain number of people actually petitioning the board prior to the meeting to say, look, this is something that the board won't listen to us on this and we want it on the agenda. And actually it ends up falling, could be a power decision by the board chair, right? Because the finalization of that agenda probably requires a vote of the board that has to be brought up. So you can't, I don't think it's enough even just to get one person who wants it, who's a board member who wants it on there. The board itself would have to vote to add it. So issues like that, I would propose, like you're saying, you can get a consensus of the group and get a vibe for what's going on, but you can't make a decision on it, and you can't form policy around it. This is also why special meetings come about. If someone said, oh, we really wanted to address that, and we have this annual meeting, we're all here, but we can't do it because it wasn't on the agenda. Well, that becomes what the agenda is for the special meeting that you're going to request. Then a special meeting can be for that single purpose. And that way that special meeting would be noticed just like the annual meeting so that the public knows what's going to be acted on.
Okay.
Right. Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, and this actually is an unrelated comment, but I would like to ask a favor. In your meeting coming up on liability and the one on treasurer, could you touch on the topic of how a Lake District handles payroll if they were going to start hiring people? For instance, we're looking into hiring clean boat, clean water inspectors and giving them pay, and we're not sure how to do it. And of course, this has to be something discussed at the annual meeting before we can even get approval. But I got to have a plan put together to present at the annual meeting so I can show our community how it would work if they approved it. And I'm struggling with how to do this. So I'm sure you guys have dealt with this before. I was just wondering if you could touch on a little bit on it during the liability section, like, do we need workman's comp?
Yep.
Sure.
And then on the treasurer section, like, how do we do payroll and what do we have to do? I mean, it's, I just don't know.
I've made a note of that, and we'll make sure that we get that. I'm sure I would have thought of to cover that anyway, but yeah, we definitely will cover that.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt there about that.
No problem.
Oh, that's fine.
I was gonna to just get back to the other question for a second. I was gonna say that at the annual meeting, you could definitely have a discussion about this new issue that has come up. But it would have to be, the special meeting would be noticed, and that would provide the opportunity for additional discussion with people that weren't at the annual meeting that might have a stake in that discussion to happen before the vote actually occurs.
Yeah.
And I think what finally dawned on me is the criticality of the agenda, not only for the annual meeting, but for your quarterly board meetings. Because at the quarterly board meeting, if it's not on the agenda, you can't vote on it. So the commissioners, right? So I think just for the whole commissioner community, the agenda is like critical if you want to get anything done. You have to really put a lot of thought into it.
Yeah, and we have some resources because this is the same pickle again that all local governments face because they all fall under the same open meeting requirements. So we can send out some resources from the UW-Madison Division of Extension Local Government Center that help talk about how to frame that agenda. I see Bill Pingle has a question, so go ahead and unmute yourself if you want to chime in.
Okay. Yeah, just one question on the annual meeting notice. So if you're publishing it in the newspaper, do you have to publish the full budget, as well as the meeting notice, or can you just put a link, like just say, or a notice that just says, go to the district website to see the budget?
Mike, what is your first take on that one?
I meant to look up what exactly was required to be included in a class notice before, because there may be something in there. I guess I would go back to the idea of it's better to provide more than less, though I'm not sure that, like, that seems like a lot to be putting into a small newspaper ad, right? So I'm honestly not sure what most districts have done in the past on that one.
Yeah, we did do the full thing for some years, and then the last couple of years, we just said, we said, see the Lake District website, put the link, put the address for that, the URL for that, to see the detail for the budget. Didn't know if that was proper or not.
The budget that you'll find the example of in People of the Lakes, our guidebook, is really formatted to satisfy all the different pieces of statute. And it's also formatted so that it fits on one piece of paper. So it fits on an 8.5 by 11. And so ostensibly the other side of that piece of paper would be the agenda and the other pieces of the notice of the annual meeting. So I could see how printing those in the paper could be seen as sort of exorbitant. I think that's, if you're a really small district and you think that notice in the paper really isn't going to reach a lot of people, it might behoove you to stick to the other idea, which is that you can reasonably ascertain the mailing address of the handful of people who are not property owners but reside within the district. So that's a way you don't necessarily have to include the budget. You still are required, because it's a public meeting, you have to have sort of a generic notice of the meeting posted in different places, just as you do the quarterly meetings of the board. But that doesn't require the full publication of the agenda.
Was, Eric, this is Larry, just real quick.
Yep.
Yeah, we're struggling with this ourselves. And so on page 74 of People of the Lakes, it seems to me that the way we've interpreted what you guys put in there, I think you guys wrote this. It talks about Wisconsin statute 33.29. And it says that the budget has to present and there's just a whole list of stuff: revenues and expenditures from the preceding year, revenues and expenditures for the first 6 months of the current year, and it goes on and on and on.
Yep.
And it even has a statement here that we've added this year, we didn't notice before. It says we have to identify any cost in excess of $10,000.
Yep.
Is that
Itemize.
still true?
That's correct. Itemize it out.
Okay, so I don't know, it seemed to me that we didn't have a choice because it was called out in the section 33.29. Are you
Right, and that's what I'm
suggesting there's a
saying,
way, is there a way out?
I'm saying no, there isn't a way out. That technically, like, again, if you're trying to use the notice in the paper, people are saying, oh, we'll just include a link. You could try to get away with that. But if somebody in the public said, I don't have a computer and I don't have the internet, and you've posted this link, it doesn't help me, I want to see the budget, you have to somehow provide the budget to them. But that person would also have to be someone who's not a property owner who lives in the district, right? So let's just call this person Tim. If Tim is the one who's aggrieved by not being able to see the budget because Tim doesn't have a computer and wants to know what's going on, you could add Tim to the physical mailing list, just like a property owner, so that Tim gets a copy of the budget, just like all the other property owners do.
Eric, this is Bill again. So in our district, I don't believe we have to verify this, but I don't believe we have anyone who resides within the district that is not a property owner. So if that's the case, we wouldn't have to put it in the newspaper anyway, correct?
The only thing you have to put in the newspaper is just a notice that the meeting is happening.
With being held, right? Okay.
And you probably should include the agenda on that too, just in the way you would if it was, you're really supposed to be noticing your quarterly meetings, but I don't think you're required to notice quarterly meetings in the paper.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And again, I think in People of the Lakes, it's sort of in the appendix, it's in the back. It's an example, and if you're on the web page, it's just I'm trying to find it. Sample Lake District budget. So it's Appendix F, and that's just formatted to fit on one page and to satisfy all the different notice requirements of a budget. All right, Mike, people are heading out, which is fine. It's a lovely but windy day in Stevens Point. I saw lots of great pictures of the sunset last night. It looks like people are happy that spring seems to be maybe actually happening. Got a question here from Paul and Julie. How do we get framing of agenda information? Not sure what that means. So this is from Paul and Julie Mazzolini. How do we get framing of agenda information?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what that would mean.
I think one of the quandaries that came up, Mike, was, this idea that somehow an agenda has to be formed, but you can't have a lot of debate between meetings about what's going to be on the agenda. And so oftentimes I think what Krista was suggesting before she left was, contact the secretary and let them know, or contact the chair, and just, it's a unidirectional thing. It's just saying, I want to add the aquatic plant report to the agenda. And so that gets added to
Sure.
the agenda.
And I think it makes it incumbent on the board to be thinking ahead from one meeting to the next. So this, while the board is meeting, to be talking about what's going to be talked about at the next meeting. So if you know that there's an issue that's coming up that's going to be important, you've already talked about that being added to the agenda.
And I just message them to see if they want to unmute themselves and ask that question.
I think the
Okay, she said they're good.
great. I was going to say too, I think that the board chair can be given some latitude in deciding what's going to be on the agenda. If it's a new issue that comes up, the issue can be forwarded to them, and maybe they get to be the ones. Maybe one of the other officers decides what extra gets added onto to that agenda.
Yeah, and often, I mean, that's sort of why people maybe want to be board chairs, is because they want that power of agenda setting. That's actually, it's not like there's a whole lot of power struggles or accolades that go out to people who are Lake District commissioners and get elected to executive positions like the board chair. But the board chair does get that sort of agenda, usually gets that agenda developing power. We're going to include also, when we send out the update, probably either Friday or Monday, just saying that the recording is posted. You can share it with any other commissioners. Please forward that around. We'd love to see more people getting access to that. I also found there's lots of great resources from the Local Government Center in Madison. They put together a couple of interesting things. One is sort of a series of discussions about things like open meetings law and problems created by electronic communications and a walking quorum. So they sort of walk you through what that might look like and what to avoid. They also have a series of short videos about adhering to Robert's Rules of Orders. So sometimes, it's not like there's always a parliamentarian in the room who's well-versed in Robert's rules. People sometimes struggle with how to proceed if it seems like the meeting stalled out and you're not sure where you were at as far as a motion that's been lacking a second or things like that. So those videos can be pretty helpful and just a way to kind of keep yourself on the rails.
And before we go, I'll put in a plug for next week's session. We've already talked about a little bit, but liability and insurance, we'll have a representative from the Horton Group, who is insurer that handles a lot of municipal governmental clients. So some lake districts use Horton Group. They also have a directors and officers policy that current members of Wisconsin Lakes can access through us. He'll be there to talk a little bit about the difference between directors and officers insurance and general liability possibilities and policies. And then I've also have an invite out to an attorney. Hopefully you'll be able to come in and talk from the legal standpoint about those kind of liability questions and sort of how to deal with the risk reward consideration on when to insure and when not to.
And Karen's asking where to go for the information. I'll include links in the email that we send out to everybody who registered for this meeting. That'll include some links to those local government center resources and other relevant information. So try and keep you all up to speed. There's lots of stuff out there. If you just Googled UW-Madison Division of Extension Local Government Center, a lot of that stuff will pop up as well, but we'll make sure to get the right links out to you. All right, well, I want to thank you all for what you do for Lakes, and thank you for joining us, and some of you will see next week.
Likewise, thanks for attending.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Bye.
Bye, everybody.